stay in your quarantine space while we charge.
Can't hear you. I can't hear
And
you.
welcome to Quarantime. This is the second edition of an improvised show that's trying to ask the question, just beneath the headlines, how there is so much innovation going on in this time of quarantine response. We came up with this idea about a week ago, and it was really styled after several friends of mine put together something maybe 10 or 15 days ago called distance resistance. This was realizing that we would be physically distanced, but not necessarily socially distanced. How would we respond to that? And what's happened since then has been a flood of amazing innovation. You know, we're all part of these interesting global innovation communities working on things. And it's almost like since this crisis came in, we've all been called to service. How do we respond? How do we help out? And that's what we want to get at. We probably want to do this a couple times a week. We want to focus on the response in the arts, in deep science, and in how the activism community is focusing. And today's edition is kind of looking at this whole bottom-up nature of the response. The fact that at a time of great need, we're all self-organizing. Co-hosting this thing with me is my good friend, Mickey McManus, and also with me today is John Clippinger. Can you guys all hear me today?
We can.
I can hear you. Yep.
How you doing?
Great. So just a little bit of a rundown of kind of how we're going to do today. You know, John, we came up with the theme of this show. We called it "The Commander is Us," because people keep using this warfare analogy. We're fighting in a war. Usually in a war, we wait for commander to tell us what to do. But here, the commander is us. An awful lot of people are figuring this stuff out in real time. And you've done work on network centric warfare with DARPA before we collaborated on the book From Bitcoin to Burning Man. Mickey, you and I have collaborated when you were at Autodesk, and you're at BCG now. In a few minutes, we're going to bring in Pamela Parkinson, who has been working with a group of people globally on connections for innovation. We'll throw it over to Dale Doherty, founder of the Maker Movement and Make Magazine. I mean, makers are not only a community, but they're organized to solve problems. We're going to dig into that. And then we'll go to San Francisco's innovation infrastructure and talk a little bit about small business and stuff. So that's, and by the way, the concept behind this, Mick, you may want to talk about this is, okay, so one thing that's going on in the media these days is we have bits of the DNA of every media floating around, better than a virus, right? We have a bit of broadcast and a bit of social and chat going on here. We want this to be innovation and whiteboard. So you may want to talk a little bit about what we're trying to do with tools and with whiteboarding and with connections here. And then, John, I want to talk to you a little bit about network-centric warfare.
Sure.
You bet. Thanks, Peter. Hey, Peter, can you switch to the whiteboard screen? I don't know if that's we're testing out everything as we go.
There it is. Mickey's whiteboard screen is right here. You're on.
So one of the things we're doing is we're trying to look at, could we use an infinite persistent whiteboard that actually lasts past each episode so that we can see what maybe John talks about today, and we can also kind of zoom out or pull over and maybe go to last week and be able to understand what we were talking about in our first episode. You know, how does what John talked about relate to what Anna Fedorova mentioned last week, or how might this tie into something Peter was talking about the arts and how things are going? So we're trying to experiment with this. We're using a whiteboard called Miro, which allows for persistent whiteboarding. And the reason we're doing this is because often drawing is a lingua franca between disciplines. If I say there's this thing, I can just draw a blob. And if I say there's this thing that's related to some other thing, I can draw a blob, and the arrows become verbs and the blobs become nouns. And even if you're talking about synthetic biology and he's talking about network warfare and she's talking about small businesses, we have to boil it down into just blobs and arrows, and we can actually start to see a common operating picture. because we're getting it out of our head. And so that's the aspiration. We're experimenting with different tools each week, but this board is also live, being shared. We sent a link around it after last episode. I'll share it again. And then ultimately, we'd like to invite the listeners to actually be able to draw. We'll probably have to figure out the whole moderation of drawing, but leadership comes through getting your ideas out of your head and helping find weird connections between things. And so that's what we'd like to do here. We think it's kind of a secret superpower for people who want to lead, and also just for makers in general. And we'll be hearing a little bit more from, I think, the maker community every episode as well. So that's about it.
John, let's talk about kind of going back to the 1990s when network centric warfare was conceived of really by the Department of Defense for an environment where there was so much going on all at once that the very notion of a top-down response was a bit silly. We take this for granted almost in a world of wikis today, but look at this response this week. You have multiple state and local governments with one idea, often quarreling with the president. You've got makers responding. Today's whole show is about that. So take us back to some of the precepts and the beginning of this thinking.
Peter, thank you for doing this. I think when we talk about this being on a war footing right now, and the president is talking about that in that context, being a war president, and there's a presumption to think that this is a centralized sort of command and control system. But I think almost like more than 20 years ago, even before the Iraq War, there's a recognition in the Defense Department, and it actually came out of some work done at RAND, that it takes a network to defeat a network. And so when you had the whole riot, the Black Hawk Down in Mogadishu, if you remember that event, it was very shocking because we had a military power, a U.S. presumption of power and technology, and they were able to be taken down and actually dominated by tribal warlords. And so that set off a signal within the Defense Department saying that the way we think about command and control really doesn't work anymore, because the time it goes up to the commander and back into the field is too late. And you really have to delegate decision-making out to the edge of the organization. And so there was a whole effort in a network-centric warfare effort to imagine networks of people working together. And when you talk about what they call asymmetric warfare, when you have a small group, a network, a cell competing against a state actor, the flexibility they have and the ability to improvise, IEDs, things like that, is a whole different way of fighting a war. And so they came up with a concept, and this of network-centric warfare that led into development of special operations forces. And this really became apparent in Afghanistan and the Iraqi war, that the current method of dealing with Al-Qaeda and eventually ISIS was ineffective. So they had to develop special forces. And the key element here is that you had to delegate decision rights to the edge of the organization. So you had to identify those people who had the expertise and were in the situation. They had a situation awareness that others didn't have. And that person could be of low rank. It didn't have, so you would give that person, it could be a corporal, basically the powers that were generally delegated to a colonel. And what became critical here is that you had to identify, so does that person is that person who they think they are? Is that really the person? The whole issue of credentialing and knowing who you're dealing with, but also did they really have the information they needed? And so once you can verify that, then you allocate decision rights to that party that can act, and then they act, and then you basically refresh those decision rights based upon the situation. So you create this highly flexible network. And that evolved into a whole concept of what we call a situational awareness. And the Marine Corps were one of the first to develop this concept and adopt this concept, but special forces do this all along, is that rather than having a top-down command and control system, you create awareness of the battlefield situation. And you have the commanders, sort of the colonel level or the general level, set the objectives. and then that's a sort of 3-level system, and then you have a set of captains sort of make or tasked with a plan, and then you have the lower levels actually trying to implement the plan, and they adapt in real time. Each can see what the other's doing.
How does translate that to me to this environment? Because here we have this highly distributed agent that's fighting us, that's kind of moving around the world quickly. We have suddenly, because maybe there wasn't situational awareness and people didn't quite understand it, not fast enough preparations. And then all of a sudden, people trying to understand supply chains and manufacturing, people implementing testing, we're beginning to see that we need different rules for dense areas and not dense areas. And we see this tug of war between what people need from Washington and need to do themselves. So kind of connect these up for us, and then perhaps to all of these innovation networks of everybody trying to jump in and help, and how we sort that out.
Well, exactly the point. I mean, so in the same sense that it takes a network to defeat a network, I mean, I would argue it takes a digital virus to defeat a biological virus. And that actually relates back to something that was earlier in your first episode. I think Andrew said, I thought was very profound. And he said, we basically were able to teleport a digital representation of the virus and then synthesize it at the other end. That kind of flexibility, the ability to capture something in a digital form, is unique and actually is total a game changer. So the ability to get access to the right information at the right time and have that information validated and then have it being used by people who have the ability to act upon it is a critical factor in being able to have rapid response. So when we think about what's happening here, one of the things that we're advocating in the group is a project we call NOVID, basically NOVID, and it's a decentralized system. It's actually giving individuals the power, in a sense, the same sense in network centric warfare, to act and respond and organize and mobilize resources. The key element to making that happen is that you have to verify the individuals, and who they have the right decision rights. They have the ability to access the information. The information is valid. These are important things. You can't gloss over them. But once you do that, you create a trusted network, and that trusted network can be validated. So we have things like the blockchain. We have the ability to create these credentials. We have the ability to. We've been working on this kind of infrastructure for the last 20 years. So it's available through a Linux Foundation. There's a way of building out this next generation infrastructure. So right now we're stuck in the old infrastructure. We're still in a command and control model. I mean, everyone's waiting for the president to act. Everyone's dependent upon the governor. But if the right people have the right information at the right time, and that can be validated, that they can self-organize and they can distribute and virally counter the effects of the virus.
John,
collect the right data.
This is a great segue for us to bring in someone who's been at the center of a lot of this, Patricia Parkinson. Patricia, are you there? I think you're on mute, so one of us will unmute you.
Yeah.
There we go. Now you can hear me?
Fabulous. Okay, so this is really the story of self-forming networks. So Patricia, you and I met. Some of the best people I've met in the last 2 weeks through all of this. Have you noticed that?
I have.
When you drop physical friction and you don't have to drive somewhere or get in an airplane, the coolest people are out there. We met, I think, 2 Saturdays ago when you and your colleague Erica Blair convened a meeting that said, how can we get people and influencer networks together to start disseminating memes that might get people to stay at home? But now you've put together Quarantime, which is a global group that's focused first on safety, then on how do we create teams, and then ultimately how the tech industry responds. So what I've been honored to be part of and witnessing in the last couple of weeks is this amazing distributed network forming, a little bit like John's been describing. So talk to us a little bit about that, your background, and what's been going on.
Just kind of start with my background. I've had this very organic experience in my career of working with distributed teams of sorts in kind of a creative environment and trying to like reverse engineer it. Most recently, in the last 2 years, I've been focused in blockchain, building distributed systems and working on projects like Everpedia, which is the world's largest encyclopedia on the blockchain, and platforms like Telos, and setting up governance systems on networks like EOS. So we've been very deep in the thinking of how do you create models for distributed teams in these ways. And actually in the last 9 months, I've been building one of those actually, which is relevant to what's happening now. So when Quarantine came together and rallied towards like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs of like, let's just save lives. That's the biggest impact that we can have with our combined skill set in the amount of time that we had. We threw all of our resources at that and pretty much tapped anyone in our network that we thought could help spread, amplify that message. And what we came across in the process blew our minds. Pretty much every single person in our network said a full yes. And it did feel like wartime drafting. So we were still working on the campaign initiative, but at the same time, had to figure out a way of coalescing people to like find each other. One sense is in the form of quarantines. So having digital or physical support networks of saying like, we're in this together, let's take care of each other physically, emotionally, socially, etc. But then separate to that, quarantines joining around creating initiatives in the space, and us just having this pool of really capable switched in people that wanted to openly contribute, and seeing ourselves as a little bit of a conduit for making those matchmaking connections.
The homepage for hashtag Quarantine, which includes in it some of the Facebook bugs that you created. So tell us a little bit about why the first initiative was this, and some of what you've been measuring in terms of getting a meme out there.
When we sat down, and Peter, you were part of that first call, and we kind of had our own war room of sorts to go, like, where can we have impact in 48 hours? We realized that the act of quarantining was, by definition, invisible. And we're wondering, how can we make quarantining visible? Because I know that in my life and other people around me, a lot of people weren't quarantining at that time. And we needed to create a social proof campaign to kind of encourage that type of behavior change. So we thought that the largest way of doing that and the fastest way was through Facebook, and started with one profile frame. And we noticed within our own networks that it grew in popularity, and we started adding new frames in, reached out to an influencer network. And we're still tracking down stats right now. It's a little hard to find with Facebook these days, but we've seen our frames just pop up in places like Nepal. And when you look at people's friends list, their friends lists are filled with them. So we've been really pleased to see how far and wide that campaign has spread, and are now looking at translating it to different languages.
It's interesting, when we were talking a couple weeks ago, we were struggling for metaphors, how to put this together. Remember, one thing we talked about was in World War II, there was the meme, loose lips sink ships. And if you think about it, the first portion of that is an action, loose lips, which is like, don't blab. And the second half of that is a benefit statement, which is, if you do the first thing, people won't die. And so when we came up with stay home, save lives, it was almost the same thing. There was an action, stay home, and a benefit, people wouldn't die.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're trying to contextualize ourselves with people as doing multiple of these initiatives that you mentioned at parallel. We're working with tech companies to bring them together and to frame the conversation around connection. We're working on materials to help people resource themselves in coming together. But really, what really matters is that saving lives piece. Like anything else, that's every minute that we're not working on it, we sit here going, okay, how many people is that going to impact more because they're not following quarantine in that sense? So it really puts things in perspective for you.
So walk us a little bit further. Give me a sense for the kind of global people, but now you're moving on to this notion of quarantines. How do we quarantine? What's the advice that you guys are coming up with? Because one of the first things I noticed when this started is I felt isolated. I've been isolating with a partner, so I'm around a human. But the first thing I realized was I'm part of all of these interesting innovation groups. We go to conferences, we work on things, and suddenly I felt like a brain in a box. Where were my APIs or something? So you've been evolving this notion of teaming, both for, I think, mental health and also for people to solve problems. So how do people quarantine, and kind of what are the guidelines you're coming up with?
Yeah, so let's just start with people directly in their own kind of network. I think the first is acknowledging that the people you're rallying with, like, this is what we're in together. So calling it for that, and whether you use the word quarantine or something else, that helps set the framing. And then everyone has different approaches to this, and we're looking at creating like a list of recommended questions to ask. But it's really going through your checklist of like, do you have enough food? Do you have support nearby if you need it? Like all those kind of contingency plans, and discussing them as a group, not just from the point of logistics, but also from the point of like, oh, we're actually asking the same questions, having to go through the same considerations, and their sense of like support in that inherently. Otherwise, with quarantine teams, we're looking at how they can support each other, because if some people are in some location and others in another location, how can separate quarantine teams almost do a mix and match to support each other's needs? So we're creating resource guides for that. And then also working with tech platforms like Facebook at ways we can integrate this directly into the platform, because as much as we can have large reach, if we can come directly from a platform's interface, obviously that is a much better and more impactful approach to this type of scaling up of initiative. So that's kind of like the independent side of quarantines. But within our organization around initiatives, we're creating ways of being able to document someone's level of interest, their skills, their availability, and then having a list of open initiatives that are available within our organization, and then somehow matchmaking between the two of those. We're pulling from our past experience and from experts that we're consulting with. But what's interesting about this is, as much as I feel like I've been in that problem for a long time, the rate of innovation right now is so fast, and there's so many more voices involved, that it's kind of like, well, let's just bring all of that in, while still trying to be effective. But we're definitely iterating much faster than I have in the past on things like this, just to figure out how it works.
Things that move very quickly. We're figuring all this technology out. When we did this last time, I set this to a public feed, and then it turned out to only be my friends. We did that again. Omid, I'm getting a message from you that we have to reset permissions here, or perhaps propagate a link that has better permissions. So Omid, if you're out there, why don't you just chime in and tell us what we ought to be doing technically before we move on to Dale here. Well, there you go. Omid may not be there, but we don't mind kind of dropping the fourth wall or whatever we call it, try to get this thing right. I want to bring in another guest now, and I'd love to. In fact, we could bring in several of us, because we've got on the table this concept of collaboration and networks, and to me, there are so many of these networks that we formed. You think of World Economic Forum or Aspen Institute or all the maker groups, and suddenly it's almost like we're all sleeper cells that are sitting in wait for a moment. And then the question is, how do we contribute and bring about change in that moment? No one has been organizing people to do more on both the community and the physical front than my good friend Dale Doherty. Dale's the founder of Make Magazine and the Maker Movement. And then Dale, you and I worked very closely for several years during the Obama administration on Maker Cities. And then it's really in the last couple of weeks that suddenly the Maker Movement has been thrust into the center, when we realized that our supply chains might not be up to the task for where we needed both protective gear and other solutions. And you wrote a very interesting piece yesterday called Plan C, in which you suggested that there was government, there was industry, but perhaps in the world today, there's Plan C.
Yeah, good to see you, Peter, and everyone. In some ways, the Maker Movement has been preparing for this moment for a long time. I almost think that, 3D printers and the like were first sort of adopted and explored by makers, and people made fun of them and other things, and the stock market on 3D printing went up, and then it went down, and we said, 3D printing, it's just a fad. Well, there's probably more 3D printers in the homes of more people today than certainly ever, and this is a moment when we need to use them. We need to figure out that we not only have a technology out there and not only have a great application, but we have people that are trained to be able to do this. And I think where I was trying to go with the the idea here, just watching what was going on with COVID-19 and sort of, to be honest, an ineffective government response and a kind of non-committal industry response. And in contrast, I saw these maker communities jumping in, getting on Slack, Facebook, say, what can we do? And many of them had roles in perhaps in their day job in industry, but they were kind of combining in new ways and says, here's my skill set. They didn't, one thing I was kind of interested, nobody's using their LinkedIn link and saying, here, look at who I am. They're just saying, hey, I'm a designer. I'm doing this. What can I do to help? Really brief and to the point. And I think this is, I'll credit back to Neil Gershenfeld, who started the Fab Lab network, the basic idea that you could design a digital, do a digital design, and you could send it anywhere and everywhere around the world and have it replicated, in every locality. So we see this global combinatorial innovation happening to create designs, all people working together on that, and maybe deciding which designs are the best or most practical. And then we have networks of makerspaces and fab labs and other things where people can actually go in, even in small towns, and make these things that don't seem to be coming in time, and fill some of the shortages that we see for hospital equipment and protective gear.
I want to bring in some of the other people. I also think we may have fixed the permission thing there. But I want to bring John and Pamela back.
Hi, John.
Hey, everybody. Patricia. I said Pamela.
Patricia.
I keep getting your name wrong. Except that
it's double P's that confuse.
Our minds are scrambled these days. There's all of us have been thinking a bit about how the tech industry responds, both in terms of tools, in terms of getting people to take action, and in terms of trying to make things more pro-social. Patricia, one of the interesting things is in the group that we have, Tristan Harris, who's been an outspoken critic of Facebook, suddenly realized that he was looking for, like, how do I start something that is not based on a business model that strip mines us. And as he was struggling to think through what would his organization do, suddenly this thing shows up and it kind of like organizes the whole world on one side of a problem. And he suddenly started working with you and with Facebook and all of this. So let's talk a little bit about kind of ways the tech industry can respond, but also why this moment is different than the moment that preceded it in terms of how we all might work together or understand how in a much more virtualized world we're collaboratively solving problems, very different than like 15 minutes ago when we were so polarized.
Yeah, on the Facebook side, I think that our realization was that they are the most powerful force right now to help bring us together. Otherwise, we're going to fall apart. And although we might have been vocal critics in the past of Facebook's business model or a way that they approach connection in the world, that right now, and this quote from someone within Facebook really stuck with me, that we've lost our cultural and institutional knowledge about how to deal with pandemics. And this is the first time, I think, in humanity that's happened, as well as the first time in humanity that we're all focused on the same problem. So kind of flipping that lens on Facebook and giving them the opportunity to say, this is your moment in history. Like, this is the moment to lean into for good, and then crowdsourcing as many ideas as possible for them to lean into that sense.
Well, John, a lot of the work that you've been doing has similarly been kind of trying to seize a moment to accomplish two goals, right? Which is, or one of the big ideas that's out there is, in order to, at some point, in order to understand what's safe, we need to do lots of testing. We need to know perhaps who eventually has immunity, which means we almost need to know down to the individual where they've been and what they've been doing. China has been doing this. This suggests surveillance state, but perhaps using blockchain or other mechanisms that allow us to maintain our sovereignty, we could have both the ability to understand with great precision kind of who's safe, who's not, or how data's how a virus
Yeah.
is proceeding, and at the same time solve for not getting strip mined.
Well, Peter, thank you for that. I mean, as you well know, I've never been a big fan of Facebook, and I'm not on it. And while I was at Harvard when it started, I was rather vocal. And I'll persist in that perspective, because I think what we have is a historical moment, actually, to transition from these top-down aggregated platforms to highly decentralized systems, and so the technology there exists for collecting data, verifying data, giving people an identity credential that they control, data they control, and using things like zero-knowledge proofs to have highly detailed information of people without necessarily disclosing that information or even sharing that information. There are various techniques for validating it. And this has been done at scale in British Columbia. It's part of the Hyperledger Indie platform. There's a whole community that's been working like 15 years on this. So to me, this is a big opportunity to make the transition, particularly to a decentralized infrastructure that is a self-organizing infrastructure and not default to a platform. It's a single platform. So I have rather strong feelings on that. I think it's a great opportunity. I think it's the only way, if you really want to have something that's fast acting and something that be trusted. This issue of trust becomes absolutely critical. I can get into the weeds and talking about non-fungible tokens and how you can create credentials that can be trusted and things like that. But there is a temptation to say, okay, we can do this very rapidly. There's also, we're transitioning into a new era. We're really getting the fusion of the physical, the virtual and the physical here. And this opens up things that can be done on Zoom, for example. I think Zoom, moving into 3D environments, to digital twins, this whole ability to create high fidelity digital twins, have people participate in those worlds, affect those worlds, have people eventually make money in those worlds, get credentials in the world, in and out of the physical and the virtual, is where it's going. And this is going to accelerate that process. But how we lay the foundation for that is absolutely critical. So I'm a stickler for a lot of these things, as you know.
And I brought Mickey back in. One of the things I think we're seeing here is I mean, this is almost like we've been transported a little bit into a science fiction future, where everything is virtualized, and we have to use tools differently. And it's also very clear that the values decisions that we make on how we work together are really matter. And
I'd love to add something on that. If that's okay. I'm I love the idea of prophets of science fiction and this idea of like building into this emergent future. And I've been like really surprised in the last couple of years working in blockchain, not seeing a lot of science fiction on the leading edge of putting language to this. And that's one of the challenges we've come across in the last couple of years as like a background as a creative director and a brander is as soon as you talk to people about the movement that was happening, is blockchain, they'd switch off, say it's too technical for me, it's Ponzi scheme, So we're looking for new language to describe this movement that we all in the industry kind of found ourselves in with very similar ideals, ideologies, but not having the language for it. And I'm curious for everyone on the call, and just as a prompt in general, it's like, if we are moving towards this type of distributed, decentralized future, what kind of language can we attach to that in a way that people can kind of hold on to and go, okay, this is what we're working towards? And I think that we tend to get stuck up on technical language a little too often.
Just, Peter, can I comment on that a little bit? Is that I do think that I agree that when you
hold on, John, back up. Can you hear me, John? I was adding you to the stream. Go ahead, you're on.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I say, so as soon as you sort of evoke the blockchain, I mean, and we've had jokes about how it was a magical sort of amulet that would cure all things. I think that in fact, what you're transitioning, and I'd be interested in Vicky's comments on this, the whole idea of generative systems, the whole idea of generating value rather than extracting value embedded in nature. I think this is part of a larger conversation that I've been involved in around the ecological system, the climate change, the equity. We're moving from mechanical models to biological models, where things that are generating value rather than extracting value. And that is a profoundly different way of looking at things. Things that are autocatalytic, actually, that are self create their own metabolism. And so the biological metaphors, I think, appropriately framed, I think can be very appealing to people.
The biological metaphor right now is the virus.
Yeah,
but that's why I say that's why Andrew's comments were I thought so interesting. And Nikki comment when he talked about teleporting, the virus, a digital representation.
Well, and I'll jump in for a sec, John.
Yeah, please do.
I think I love Patricia's comment, though. Historically, we might look to the prophets of science fiction to see things. I do think there are some people out there. Nick Harkaway wrote a wonderful, weird exploration of police state meets witnessing meets distributed indexing, and only people could vote that actually had read about the law that was being passed and things, in his book Gnomon, which came out late last year. I think Robin Sloan has been experimenting with things. Hanu has experimented with Quantum Thief and others. But I do think that this is a challenge in that the pace at which things are moving has in a sense exceeded the publishing speed of both writers exploring this and also the classic publishing model. And there are some really wonderful things. I've seen groups pop up down in LA and other places of science fiction futures, where they bring in somebody like an N.K. Jemisin or someone else who's really a brilliant science fiction author, and say, hey, how does this scenario play out? And in the history of the Department of Strategic Surprise, it would not be surprising at all to always have a science fiction author or two, not because they're going to actually understand science fiction. William Gibson was here in town in San Francisco a few weeks ago, and someone said, how do you stay so close to knowing what will happen with AI? And how did you end up writing, this prescient new book about AI? And he's an author, if people haven't heard of him, interesting sort of evolution of cyberpunk and stuff. And he said, oh, I don't know anything about AI. If I knew something about AI, I wouldn't be able to write a good story. Like, I hope I don't know anything about AI. It would shut my brain down. Like, you actually are following me to see why I understand the future? That's crazy. When I heard the singularity is near, and I read the work on the singularity that Ray was writing, I thought, that's boring. That's terrible. But then when I thought, wait a second, what about a half-baked singularity? What about like the AI is actually an African-American woman? What about if it's not the way that we think? What if it's like just off the sidebar and coming from a different direction? That's an exciting story. And I think a lot of times the science fiction authors help us understand the social dynamics, help us understand if you have this technology, how does that play out in the unintended consequences, the future crimes, the future phenomena? But we're watching this kind of real. Last week, we talked with Andrew Hessel, who leads the Human Genome 2.0 project. He said this is an alien attack by an enemy that we have no radar now.
We lost you.
Yeah, the aliens came from below instead of from above. We were looking in the wrong direction.
I read yesterday, someone sent me a short story from 1928, E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops, and where everybody lives underground, and they live alone. They don't touch each other, and there's a lot of resonance there. And they don't go outside anymore. They don't. The air is foul, but everything's kind of controlled by the machine, and then one day it stops.
I want to ask each of you a question to think about. We're going to go to Darlene Chu Bryant in a moment, but all of you, including Mickey, who's off the air now but coming back, have been working with teams around the world, and I think everyone's having this experience that they are, in fact, sitting in the future, and you're sitting here planning both for the immediate crisis and what's next. And I'd almost suggest there's like three acts here. There's the immediate thing of what happens in the next couple of weeks, and the fact that time now is so precious. Since we're in this exponential moment, a second right now has a lot more value than a second in a few weeks when there's more virus out there. It's the opposite of playing video game where or game show where at the end to keep your interest you get more points. Now you get a lot more points if you do something early. So that's Act 1. There's Act 2, which is the whole economy is going to be a startup, like how you spin the thing up again. And when you spin it up, how is it different? How are consumer preferences different? Do we go out as much? Do we care about restaurants as much? Do we get on airplanes and do conferences as much? I mean, spinning this up again is something I think you're all thinking about. And then finally, there's kind of like a third act, which is, okay, maybe nothing will change, or maybe this will have a big impact on capitalism, preference. There's a moment here in which Bernie Sanders, Andrew Yang's, and Donald Trump's policies all appear to be converging on one another, which is weird. So when the smoke clears, many people are thinking about the future of capitalism, the future of how do you end up with less extractive society. And it seems like what we have now may be accelerating that. And I want to come back to that in a moment. So while you all go off and think about that, let's bring in Darlene, and then hello, Darlene. And so we'll, okay. And Darlene is muted, so let's make sure. Are you there?
Okay. I've muted. Am I okay? Okay.
Darlene leads Global SF. It is San Francisco's International Economic Development Agency. I happen to be a board member there, and we speak frequently. And Darlene, you started this. It started really with the focus on China SF, then Asia SF. We've brought in Latin America and Israel, countries around the world. And right as we were gearing up for ever more global connections and trade, suddenly, like so many other things, a wrench got thrown in that. And your organization is now at the forefront of both how do we do that at this time when the airplane thing stopped, but also you've been working a lot on how do small businesses get relief. And there's so much stuff coming out of Washington, and you're literally sitting there helping our nonprofits and businesses. So maybe you could paint a picture for what that's been like. And then I'd love to get into some of the practical advice for businesses and nonprofits on what to do, because you sit as an intermediary between government and the rest of us.
Right. Well, thanks a lot for inviting me on the show. I think that one, definitely, our heart goes out to everyone who's going through such difficult times. The good thing is that people seem to care in this city and especially in this state. And for Global SF, we're lucky that we have the resources to at least try to offer help to our small businesses. Everybody's used to seeing each other, during the daytime, walking into a shop to buy something. And now with the shelter in place, people are not able to go out as much, and if we do, we maintain the social distancing, right? That being said, what we're looking at is, one, as an SBDC contractor and service provider, we're able to say to people, hey, did you know about the SBA disaster relief loan? A lot of folks don't know about that. Actually, it offers an uncollateralized loan up to $25,000 for small businesses in this town, right? So for brick and mortar companies, that's a big help. And it actually is a loan up to $2 million. The term is up to 30 years. And the interest rate is about 3.75. Even though some people may say, hey, that's not that great of an interest rate, but we're also noticing that a lot of banks are not lending money now. So this may actually be the only deal in town to start.
And when we say a small business, does that include nonprofits? Who qualifies?
Yes, nonprofits also qualify. Typically, the companies have less than 500 employees and a revenue of less than $75 million per year. And I dare say a lot of startups now would qualify that, and a lot of nonprofits, organizations that you and we work together with and partner with would qualify as well.
And is the pool for the amount of available money, is this part of what the big federal subsidy is going to help replenish and make more of?
Yes. So this is the first package that they're throwing out, and then we're expecting another "quote unquote" stimulus package to come out. Some people have asked me, have asked. They say, if I can qualify and I get approved for a $2 million loans under the current disaster relief program, will I still qualify for the second stimulus package? And we're still looking and waiting for answers to those questions, just as an FYI.
And, I want to pick up another point that you made. which is interest rates are really low.
Right.
But when I talk to commercial bankers, what they're basically telling me is there's so much demand for money and there's so many loans that aren't being serviced that there actually isn't a lot of money. So effectively, interest rates are going up. So there's a clog here.
Yes, exactly. So which is why the SBA loan, which by the way, is not administered by the current bankers that everyone works with. They're actually applications that go directly to the SBA, Small Business Administration. The money is there, and it's actually first come, first serve. So I would suggest if anybody's interested, go and contact us at Global SF, and we're happy to send you information, or go to the loan portal at disasterloan.sba.gov/ELA.
So Global SF is actually helping to work with people, though, to make the paperwork less so they know what to do. So just maybe you could tell us what the URL is, and then like when someone contacts you, what's the stuff that you guys can do? Right, like imagine I'm a small business or a nonprofit. Well, I like help, but what now?
Okay, so this is a very good question, because actually a lot of people have realized that the loan portal is actually not working. It crashed because, as you can imagine, there's a huge demand at the moment. That being said, if folks contact Global SF, and the email address, very easy, is info@globalsf.biz. If you contact Global SF, we will help you and first of all, forward you information on the loan itself. We'll provide the loan documents. We'll tell you how to qualify for it, right? We don't approve it. I just want to make sure. And once the loan application is in, whether it's being sent in by fax is still being used, or by email, so you're not using the loan portal. And if you are approved, it's great. If you're not approved, we'll find other ways to help support the small businesses, or nonprofits for that matter. What a lot of nonprofits don't know is that there is a state-secured loan program that supports nonprofits. So that's something I want folks to look at as well.
Darlene, you work every day with companies in all over Asia and around the world that both want to invest here and that our tech community and our service community wants to work with. What's going on with everybody right now? How are people either preparing for what's next, or how are we continuing the process of innovation when all of the normal mechanisms are frozen?
Great question. I mean, I can share that Global SF has been working on a women's initiative. For example, we're calling it the Global SF Women, and in that initiative, we were actually planning to do a physical launch with a really nice event. Invite 50 really powerful women from all over the world, and then talk about the services that Global SF offers female founders. However, because of the current crisis, where flights are almost unavailable and nobody wants to get together in a room, nobody is allowed to gather, right, for social gatherings, we decided that we're going to put together a webinar or web conference, which a lot of people actually are great with. It's a great way to say, hey, this initiative is out there. We'll make it open to the public eventually, and then on the web, real time, people will learn that, oh my God, Global SF is providing these services not just to San Francisco and Bay Area companies, but also to companies to women founders in Indonesia, female founders in Latin America, female founders in Japan. So we're actually really excited that we're going to be able to do provide a service like that. We're also learning that we're partnering and we will be able to do more with other agencies up and down the state of California. So in other words, this is forcing us to work together collectively to be able to do more with fewer resources at the moment. Definitely.
As we go into the last 10 minutes or so of this, I want to bring back what we were talking to before and pick up the question that I had, which is everyone here is working with other organizations, and in a way, you're all sitting out there in the future because you're looking at such a different world. Mick, you were telling me, and by the way, for people in the audience that have questions, if you send them either on our StreamYard stream or on Facebook Live, we can get to that next. And Anna, I'd ask you to help aggregate some of that since I got so many windows open here. But Mick, I want to throw it to you because you've had some extraordinary conversations in the last couple of days with healthcare and architecture organizations that think that when this ends, it may be a very different world.
Yeah, so I'm on the board of advisors for the Healthcare Design Center. It's a 25-year-old nonprofit organization that focuses on bringing evidence-based and design science-based initiatives, research, to the design of healthcare centers. So how do we design an elder care center? How do we design an outpatient center? How do we design for when you're at home? How do we design for telemedicine? Those are all things that 25 years ago, evidence-based design and even bringing design to the table was not really considered. Architects were certainly taught creativity and art and engineering. They're one of the best professions for kind of merging both art and science and things, but they didn't really understand human science. They didn't understand how necessarily beyond human factors, how we form mental models, how we understand things, how we're maybe we feel more expansive when we have high ceilings. We feel very under pressure, and we make decisions fast when we have low ceilings. It's unfortunately why old car dealerships had really high ceilings, because you could imagine yourself in a new car, but in really small cubicles for you to like make a decision and sign a contract. so that the business world figured it out. But when it comes to actually helping people feel better, helping people feel a sense of well-being, happiness, or possibilities, it was ignored. And so the Healthcare Design Center spent 25 years building the biggest conference, having these things, creating this thing called the Pebble Project, saying, how can we work with you, build the design and the science into it, learn the studies, and then when you launch your new center, it actually has some science behind it and design behind it. In the board meeting yesterday, we had people that were CEOs and presidents of major healthcare centers who, could take a little bit of time out, but were often getting pulled back. We had a leader from Microsoft who's leading the effort around R&D and research and development around how to actually look at keeping all the systems that people use in place. We had people from Philips, who makes ventilators, by the way, and also MRI machines and others. And we had leaders and designers and design chiefs from Steelcase, who makes equipment, and from policymakers and regulators. And it was fairly harrowing, because imagine you're up in Boston or you're in upstate New York, and you're used to having an incredible hospital system, and you've got huge donations and money and donors and all that, and you always have what you need to help your patient. And what some of these people were saying is, this is the first time in our careers that we're spending 6 or 8 hours a day dealing with supply chain stuff. And then, of course, there's someone else on the phone who stands up hospitals in Indonesia saying, well, we pay doctors $6,000 a year, basically, and we're always dealing with supply chain issues. Maybe we should learn from these. The other initiative, which I think is launching this weekend, is something that the Healthcare Design Center is putting together with major hotels and major hospitals to say, hotels have a bunch of rooms available, because basically nobody's moving around and going to these conferences, but they're not designed to actually be cleaned easily, to deal with infection, to deal with other kinds of things. Could we match up hospitals with hotels, and also match them up with architects and designers that understand how to design for infection-free, for well-organized operations, to be able to do the laundry differently and other things. You could imagine the same thing is happening with doctors. I was talking to one CEO yesterday. 3,000 of his doctors are going to be out of business in the next 2 weeks, because they are a volume business. They work on, the doctor's office has a kind of rotating thing. They bring in the next patient, they bring in the next patient. That's how they make money outside of the hospital. And they're basically seeing nobody showing up. And then you've got all the mobile stuff too, like people who do mobile dentistry or help out, in the VA or other places, in VFWs and other things. And it's very hard. So this is a rare moment. And just as I think, we were talking earlier, Patricia was just talking about how do we help people understand what they can do, level of interest, how they can jump in, where they are. I love that. And I think that is happening as well in the physical environment. You can imagine a lot of buildings that even the plans for our whole, neighborhoods were designed at a time when a very different reality existed. Those buildings with the long corridor through the middle, maybe not the greatest thing when you have to go in quarantine randomly. And so there are a lot of interesting changes that are going to come out of this after.
Yeah, and I think as a country, we have to learn to think differently, more like a developing country. because we've used to being able to buy everything. We're used to get everything that we need, and we can't right now. And I think that's Jose Gomez Marquez, who runs a little devices lab at MIT, talks about how in Guatemala and in Latin America, they have a lot of secondhand medical equipment. It breaks, they can't get spare parts, they have to fix it themselves with medical backgrounds, not technical backgrounds. And they sometimes are not proud of themselves. It's like, why did I have to do that? But he's helped them see themselves as innovators. And I think, you see some of the doctors creating solutions. And, when I talk to some medical groups, they get a little bit uppity about how this won't work or that will take 18 months. But I think they're not really considering that they may not have the resources that they're used to having. And then something that works 50% of the time is better than nothing. And faced with the choice of not offering a solution to a patient and offering it to someone else is a very difficult medical position to be in, ethical issue to be in.
So Dale, I've got a question for you. You're sort of one of the instigators of this crazy maker movement, and there was this sort of huge rise of it, and then it kind of like, I've seen it in all the high schools in the world. When I was at Autodesk, we had Tinkercad, and it was being used by millions of people every month in STEAM and STEM programs. What do you think people are learning there? What do you think people are learning in the high schools? What do you think is happening? Because what I loved about the maker movement and the notion is that it's created this surplus of distributed potential, and people who understand how to use a roll of duct tape and how to understand how to sort of do a first approximation prototype. Right.
Well, you also have to remember that, what I hear from a lot of people on the ground is that a lot of kids don't understand basic tools. They've never held a screwdriver. And so there's a gap here that I think is being filled in some cases with the absence of, say, shop class and other things. But I think I think one of the interesting moments we're in right now is that the education system just fell over. It's really upside down. I'm working on a piece for that. You think about it. Who's in control now? The kid at a computer, and they're talking about making a Zoom classroom, having 30 kids sit on Zoom and listen to the teacher. Well, they could walk away from that. What are they going to do?
Doesn't happen.
Oh, it is happening. It is happening. In fact, it's like you have to log in by 8:15 a.m. so that they can count you as attending school that day.
Wow.
But it's, we're launching tonight at 5:30 Family Maker Camp, because
Family Maker Camp. Perfect.
We want it to be fun. Learning should be hands-on. It's something everybody can do. We can do it together, make together. And
where do people find Family Maker Camp, Dale?
Makercamp.com. You can find on YouTube as well and Facebook, but it's getting started. And, the point is to actually empower parents to work with their kids in new ways and not just take what the schools are giving them.
I think if we could see things like, Minecraft versus a bunch of people sitting in a classroom,
but also things that are not to do with computers, it's like, give them ideas to work with cardboard and that you have a lot of one computer households today that, the parents need to use it for one thing. The kids can't sit there and play Minecraft. So
Darlene, you were going to say
do things.
I was going to say, I'm going to share it with my daughter and son so that they can use it at home with their kids. It's like, I'm actually very excited about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, wait till we get a couple weeks out and like the repairman isn't coming. Like something went wrong with the gas grill yesterday. I'm going to learn a lot about fixing gas grills. Patricia, I have a question for you. You have been spending time on the phone with the leaders of the tech industry, which you're trying to help organize both for response and to use these new tools and to think through what's next. There must be a bunch of interesting both speculation and iterating between just huge overload for need right now, and what's next? You must be seeing interesting new thoughts that you were not necessarily seeing come to the fore just a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, you know what? Actually, the most interesting thing to point out is I think a lot of these organizations are focused on the now and maybe not yet the next. And we've been actually using that in our framing internally. And it's not our idea, but the concept of, is this a now problem or is this a next problem? And then being able to sort through some of those. So we're trying to convene leaders of tech organizations together in like war rooms of sorts to start looking at that next level. Because I know a lot of the new features are going to come out in this week and next week, and then what? So I think that's the most interesting thing that's come out. I don't know too much I have to add around the specific ideas from the tech companies, especially because I have to balance a very careful line on this right now. But I'll say from my perspective—
Do they have ideas? Are they just scared shitless?
Mobilizing the people within the organizations. So if you can get the people that are in positions of influence and to understand the impact of what's happening and then to be champions of that internally, that's kind of what we're aiming for, versus similar to the world right now, top-down leadership. It needs to be people coming to the table with ideas and initiative to follow through on those ideas. But one thing I wanted to add that I'm very excited about around this emergent future is when we were working in blockchain, and I've had many organizations that introduce people to blockchain, we've gotten down to this kind of core question of how do you get people to care? And it always came back to what was relevant to them and then giving a real life use case that they could understand, because blockchain is so far out of their comprehension. So it's like, oh, I understand gaming, or I understand agriculture in this way, and this matters to me. So I kind of get it now. So I'm curious on when the dust has kind of settled a little bit after the initial wave of this virus, and people have very organically, without even like realizing it, self-organized. And then some of us and other people who are able to be self-aware and kind of go, oh, that's what just took place. What happens when that realization comes internally? And people are like, wait, I organized my neighborhood and it kind of worked really well. And like, what if I did that with other things? I'm really excited for like the level of activation that's going to happen in the world from that feedback loop.
Omid is helping talk about learning tools. We have figured out how to use this tool so that Omid is doing remote switching and titles and music in one place, and everyone's doing other stuff. But we're getting some of the questions from the audience that he's putting in here. Peter Crane has asked us to focus on an interesting statistical issue here. Does the steadily increasing death rate for closed cases concern anyone? Which is evident, that's actually up to 16%. Some of this has to do with the numbers that we're looking at. John, you've been looking at a lot of data-driven things. Are there high-order bits or numbers that we should be using as a true north here? And do we have disagreement on those?
Well, I guess my perspective on this is that we still don't have the requisite data. I mean, we don't know how big the universe is of infected people. So how to compute the rate? I mean, it's like the denominator we do not know, and I think this is the big problem with testing. So we're getting all sorts of different kinds of fatality rates and wide variance of that. And basically, I mean, and the Italians have different measurements than the Chinese, the Germans. There's a lot of variability, and that's why I think the data collection effort is absolutely critical. And then we can start to understanding the circumstances and parameters in which how this virus acts, what groups it is particularly lethal to, what are the circumstances. But we don't have that now.
You know, it's interesting. We don't also have local data, and it's partly a federal HIPAA problem. But you know, it's really, they're not giving you granular data on what's happening in towns, and you know, they're kind of holding on to it, withholding it.
I think that one of the biggest problems now is back to the supply chain, where we don't have enough even medical test kits, right? The test kits to even test people to see who actually has the coronavirus and who doesn't. People are told to stay home, and even a lot of hospitals now, because they do not have enough of the personal protection equipment, right? Even the masks, the goggles, the GARP, that they cannot give tests. And what I've noticed and seen is, because I've been part of the supply chain in terms of sourcing, whether it be the test kits or equipment, I've found that some hospitals, because they don't have enough of the protective equipment that they are not administering tests. A lot of these tests are actually drawing blood. And so if you don't have the protective equipment, you can't draw blood, you can't touch it. So that patient goes on without being tested. And without any tests, there's no data to collect. So you don't know who's actually sick.
Well, I think the short answer to Peter's question is, yeah, of course, we're very nervous about this. We suspect that it's probably very underreported.
Yes.
And also just the PCR tests, which are looking at sort of the load you're putting out while you're actually infected, are sort of 80-year-old, 50-year-old, tests. What we aren't doing is focusing on those companies like Roswell Biotech down in San Diego and others that are actually putting proteins on silicon chips so that when a virus stumbles by and hits it, the opto sensors actually discover it's in your room right now. We have to wait until there's a crashing ICU or until there are coffins. So we don't have a radar network for this. And that's what we really need. And we also need those tests that actually tell us, have we actually gotten immunity? Have we either had a mild case of it or asymptomatic case? And has that then led to me having immunity? Because then we need to get our healthcare professionals that have gotten that immunity back out, our teachers and other critical people in our society. So I do think it's a big concern. I think our national response was pretty far away from what reality is. And I think what we don't do, and I think another book that everybody should maybe add to the book club is Skin in the Game by Nicholas Taleb, which explores non-ergodic, let's see if I say that right, systems, which means that 100 people spending $1 in Las Vegas is very different than one person spending $1 100 times. One of them can lead to ruin and the end of the game. And this particular thing, because of its geometric scaling, can lead to a non-ergodic system. It's not the same as looking at the stats. You have to look at the risk of ruin. And I think we need to really understand that. And that's why people are kind of across the board in terms of their understanding. Classical, even economists don't understand non-ergodic systems. I think, Clippinger obviously does because of your whole life in complex sciences, but most people don't. And I don't think we need to be teaching everybody this. It's just we have to actually understand it.
One thing I could just add to this: there are tests existing to do tests for if you have the antibodies.
Correct.
And they're pretty well established and available. And I think that's a really important thing.
Available is a tricky part, but yeah,
okay, I qualify that. Yes,
I will. As we're starting,
more available.
I think we have a bunch of interesting questions, comments coming in. I want to bring Anna in. Anna, are you there? Let's see. I see. Here's what we're going to have to do. To bring Anna in, we're going to do this. Hi, Anna.
Hi.
Okay. So, by the way, we're great. This is a wholly distributed kind of thing. We have Anna. Are you in LA?
I'm in LA right now.
Anna's in LA. I'm in San Francisco. John, where are you?
I'm in New Hampshire.
Mickey, you're in San Francisco?
San Francisco. Yeah, but who is Anna Fedorova? I don't know who this is.
Yeah.
Just give us a quick sentence.
I am a techie from San Francisco until very recently. I'm currently hiding out from the coronavirus in LA, but I've been a product manager in lots of early stage startups for years now, and have done everything from design to building very complex systems. And what I like is kind of understanding how to bring order to chaos. And this is definitely one of those moments where there's far too much chaos, and this is where my brain gets excited and kind of trying to create solutions, collecting sources that are relevant and important, and be part of the community that's trying to be.
Anna has been helping us build a lot of the community here, and kind of part of the team putting all this together. And by the way, funny story, Dale. You may remember when we started the whole Maker City thing, we both looked at each other and saw that term started to be using, and you're like, "Why did you come to Maker Faire and figure out what people mean by that? What is Maker City?" And so Anna was over for dinner one night, and we just started working on that stuff. That's how we started working together. But Anna, you've also been, as we've been yakking away here, you've been monitoring some of the comments. So I'm wondering if you just tell us kind of what questions people are asking, what the comments have been on the Facebook Live thread, and maybe share some of the audience questions before we wrap up.
Well, first off, there's been a lot of people who love and follow us who are on and saying hello and kind of watching what we're up to, which is really cool. Steven Sachs of Bitforms Gallery, shout out. James Hanusa, shout out. Gino Yu, a remarkable genius from Hong Kong, is saying hello. Lauren Weiniger is saying hi. Jay Zalowitz, who worked with Dale, as far as I understand, is saying hello as well, and many, many others. It's very cool to see everyone. Thank you for coming. Keep tuning in and keep bringing your insights. In terms of insights, Peter Crane has posted this interesting. Well, he's been posting interesting stuff in general, but apparently the Atlantic believes, the magazine believes that the U.S. might be the worst off of all Western developed societies in this case if we don't follow the Singapore, South Korea, China kind of lockdown model. So this is obviously what we're all trying to achieve is, kind of stay home, save lives, sort of personal lockdown, but and kind of disseminate this message as far as possible and have it land as effectively as possible. Obviously, it's very, very important, and we can get all the help we can possibly get on that. The link is in the comments. I think, we should all read this article. And James Hanusa wants, he's posting about Burners Without Borders worldwide COVID-19 call. We've been meaning to get connected.
By the way, the BW, that's a very good point. The Burners Without Borders call is coming up at 5:30 today, so that's about 20 minutes from now.
We have to be done by then.
No, it's coming up in a half an hour. When we're done, we all get to go to that. And by the way, this one thing that's worth pointing out here is the fire hose of activity going on in these innovation communities. So Burners Without Borders is organizing, itself. You see the just in the few minutes I've been on, Internet Archive is talking about what it's up to, and you see the Long Now Foundation with what it's up to. But right, BWB knows a lot about a disaster response and self-organizing, and of course the burner community is great, right? Because
now, Peter, when you say burner community, do you mean people who smoke a lot of weed? Who are these people? I just for those listeners that don't know what you're saying when you're saying burners, give me a sentence.
Yeah, well, first of all, my guess is, given who's on this call, it'd be interesting if we could do a poll and find out what percentage of us have been to Burning Man. But Burning Man, which of course is this festival that's self-organizing, has. There's an interesting point here. On the Media did a piece the other day on preppers. They caught up with the prepper community, trying to figure out were the preppers nutcases or not. And when you come right down to it, people who know how to prepare and can get out of a jam and kind of have enough stuff hanging around that if something comes up, I realize that's a lot of us burners, right? Because actually burners happen to have N95 masks, and there's probably extra toilet paper and hand sanitizer, like all this stuff you need now. Probably the only reason a bunch of us would have that in a box is we bought too much over the years. Right?
For those people that don't understand it, so Burning Man is a festival. You might have heard of it. It seems like it's always jumping the shark because it's suddenly, hyping some sparkle pony who arrived on a Saturday with beautiful clothing, and then it's a celebrity. But actually, it's 70-some thousand people who go on to a desert, high desert in Nevada, and they have to stand up an entire city with an FAA approved airport, with fire and safety and sheriffs and rangers that actually have to help this. It's all volunteer, and for 1 week, everybody is riding bicycles. Everybody is experimenting with their own identity, but it's camping. But it's pretty rough, and it's beautiful art, and it's insanely ugly art, and it's stuff in between, and it's everybody experimenting, and there's no money. And so it is a kind of pop-up experiment in building a city. And because of that, it's often used, and I met some special operations people who had an Airstream there one year who were explicitly trying to stand up, sort of pop-up distributed network stuff, because that's what happens in a war too, and it's what happens in in war-torn areas and things. So it's an interesting place. It doesn't only happen in Nevada. There's Africa Burn and other places, and there's a nonprofit organization that Peter and John and others on this call work with that really focuses on Burning Man, and then there's a group within them called Burners Without Borders that jump in and try to help for disaster relief and other things, and bringing their own knowledge to it. I just want to make sure we help explain it to people who join this, because I don't want to assume we all know.
And worth pointing out, the Burners Without Borders got created during Hurricane Katrina, right, when there was a disaster, and they all responded in real time. By the way, this is an opportunity to do a little bit of a soft plug, as long as you bring it up. John, going to Burning Man Beyond 5 or 6 years ago, and looked at self-organizing autonomous phenomena, which at the time we didn't quite understand. We saw a bunch of things belonged in a set, right? But as self-organizing contracts, currencies, cities. I think the only reason I got deeply involved in this is there was a certain alliteration between Bitcoin and Burning Man. Alliteration between like Patricia and Parkinson that I was working on earlier. But anyway, we did a book on this, and then we ended up having cities and White House people come burning. Okay, but really, that was not. You took me off topic. We were talking somewhere else.
It's hard to do. It's not hard to do.
Wrap up.
Yeah. Anna, back to Anna for any other questions before we do a round robin and get out of here.
Yeah, I think that the question. I mean, I think we did pretty well. Just kind of reviewing all the questions that are out there right now for us. The thing that I think will help wrap up the show and help us summarize what we've been talking about is in a question by James Hanusa. He says, I'd like to hear more on the next OS for society post this reboot. Can we hear you guys all kind of say something about to answer this question?
Let me just tee that up because as Patricia knows from our conversations, every time I'm on one of these calls, I'm like, let's talk about what's next. And everyone is like, we have an emergency here right now. So we're always dealing between what's now and what's next. But it does strike me that so many of us have been looking at how do you build more inclusive or just cities? How do you build an economy that is less consumptive, less extractive? And, we always have some time frame for how this might work. This seems almost like a gift, a moment in which all of these, all of the roots have been pulled up, and we can reform these things, not both reform as in its reform, but build them anew. So I think this could be a great topic to get into the future ones, but this is a great thing to end up with here, which is kind of what might come of this where we reconstitute ourselves. And I'll just lead it off by saying, as I listen to the radio and watch TV, there are all these ad buys that are clearly residual buys from a world that existed 2 or 3 weeks ago. There are ads for all sorts of junk that you could buy, or getting out of your timeshare, or I don't know, accessories for cars, whatever. But so much of what I listen to now just seems completely like useless crap. Like that could not possibly be important.
Right.
I'm wondering when we get out of this, will we just forget all that and going back to being ginormous supply chain consumers, or are we going to be different?
Peter.
John.
Okay. Yeah. I think this is an enormous opportunity. Just to say some of the things that are going on at the Media Lab and the City Sciences Group. There's a project that's underway to develop metrics around ESGs. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but it's a new set of metrics that are around environment, social, and governance. And the objective there is to identify certain outcomes that are going to facilitate the transition from a fossil, highly static society to something that is sustainable and equitable. And they're real metrics. And there's like $23 trillion sitting on the sidelines of institutions that want to invest in this. They just don't know what the metrics are. So we're seeing ourselves as being able to find those metrics, working with institutional investors to accelerate that transition into a non-carbon and more equitable, decentralized economy. That's one area. The other area is I think that this whole idea of a kernel of a self-organizing network is there that can be done. And I think they're going to build on gaming platforms, things like Unity or Zoom will be a next evolution of that. That we're going to do more things in the fusion of the virtual and digital world. So yes, I think we're moving to something. There's a huge opportunity to do the reboot, to create the new operating system. I think a lot of people are thinking about that. I think the tech is ready to do that.
Why don't we throw it over to Dale?
Okay. Well, just to be different, I don't think it's about the operating system. I think it's about the hardware. I think it's about the physical layer. And, we need to stop getting so intellectual. In some ways, it's the problem, like the CNN anchor said yesterday, where the hell are the ventilators? Where the hell are the masks? What's happening right now? I'm sorry. I'm not really thinking about the next OS for society. I think we have to address the massive problems that we're experiencing right now.
What do you, when you look at the maker community responding right now, is it largely around PPE, or what's the range of stuff that sets the urgency here?
Well, I mean, a lot of people jumped into the ventilator idea, but that's sort of a more complex medical device. And masks and protective gear are not really devices, but they can be fabricated more easily. The masks can be sewn, but I think there are still people doing that. I think there's kind of two phases here. One is, I think, the people that are going to work in small groups to create some of these designs. They may work independently. They may work together. Some of those designs are going to propagate out, and that's a second phase when people say, "Hey, this really works. Let's get more of them." And then we need them, being made everywhere. We're going to have them in university maker spaces, community maker spaces, libraries, and other things that are otherwise closed. That people need to go in and start making these things.
Is there actual initiatives that are going on that are making this happen? I mean, I've seen in makerspace, like a mask being printed, very easily. You just need to cut the fabric.
There's all kinds of, there's the shields, the masks. There's, it's.
How do we get in touch?
Part of it's the Whole Earth Catalog Reborn. There's a bunch of recipes shared with the community to go do this, and here's a lot of people doing it, and to some degree, you want to see, are there better ones, more efficient ones? But the group like Helpful Engineering, they've already done a design review of a number of submitted proposals and said, okay, these are the three that we think have the most short-term benefit, and so we're going to put more energy into those. So I think those kind of review processes, kind of peer review processes, done rapidly by people that are knowledgeable is going to be a very important part of this procose.
And can we get in touch with these projects? How do we access and connect with them?
Read my article. There's a link in the Plan C for COVID-19 on makezine.com. Has links to five of the projects, but there's a lot more of them.
Thank you for pointing out to that.
Yeah.
Plan C.
Dale, as we wrap up, on the one hand, you talk about the need to focus on the present. We have a presidential election coming up, which at some point we'll be talking about again. That is an interesting place for people to put on the table what's next, right? I mean, Biden has been accused of being kind of go back to normalcy. Bernie Sanders was much more about pushing something that's very different. We know where Trump stands. I'm just wondering, do we think this conversation of what's next will become front and center?
I don't know. I think what we see is things are happening at the state level so independently of the federal level, and at the city level, there's a little more coordination at the state level. And I think that's, when we were writing Make Your City, that's kind of the direction we thought that, where do people have the most opportunity to contribute and get involved? And so I think the metric is going to be about engagement. And I don't know about the presidential election. I really don't want to go there. I think we're trying to find more ways to get people involved and that they could believe they're creating their own future here.
Patricia, you were telling me earlier that you and Erica and Amelie, the whole team that was working on this, you were really working on future systems before, then jumped to this. But I know that just below the surface, probably as you go back to things you were working on, you're probably looking at it as a different environment, or certainly one with a different listening than it had before.
It's really funny. I've been working with Everpedia for the last 2 years, and obviously that type of crowdsourced fact checking is a lot more relevant right now. But most of all, I've been working with a network called Telos, and we wanted to rebrand them completely out of the blockchain space and kind of position them as a place for purpose. Even their logo is just like an indigo blue circle around like humanity coming together. So we realized that we had all these tools for distributed systems, but not people being able to find each other and create a plan of action to then leverage the tools. So we've been building this for 9 months, but we didn't have the use cases. And it's really interesting now to be at this intersection of, like, all my time right now is going towards quarantine because of the urgency of saving lives. Kind of, shakes you in the morning. But in the back of my head, I go, wait, I've been designing this system for the last couple of years that is like what people think we need right now. So it's an interesting line to both lean into that, like self-knowledge and trust that there's truth there to be built upon, while also recognizing the realities that people are still not ready to mass adopt blockchain. And especially because we have an urgent need right now for systems like this, we need to approach different pathways of having that type of validation of trust and different mechanisms for connection. So it'll be a lot of stacked iteration.
I want to thank first of all, I want to thank everybody. This has been extraordinary, and we're going to do more of this. And of course, we're feeling our oats here. Dale, I know you have to take off, so I want to thank you. You and I will be in touch very soon. Keep up the great work, and we'll continue to follow how the maker community is responding.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter, and thanks. Nice to see everybody.
See you, everybody.
Okay. I want to thank you again for kind of all the work that you've been doing, and we'll continue all of this. John, you and I will be talking. We'll all be talking very soon, and we're going to continue to figure out how to make this a forum, not just as a broadcast, as a conversational thing, as an ongoing whiteboard, and also what books are people reading? There's a book club out of this.
Good idea.
And Patricia, maybe can you just tell us the links into the other communities you've put together? How do people find out about the work that is going on with all of the quarantine connections? Because there's a lot of resources coming out of your shop.
Yeah, we should be launching something in the next day. Just keep an eye on Quarantime. That's TEAM at the end, not teen, now.com. So quarantinenow.com. We're going to have a page up probably called Ecosystem or something along these lines with the mapping of all the different initiatives and tents, as we call them, that we're connected with.
That's amazing. Can you please share with us as soon as you're done with that?
We are all interconnecting nodes around here, right? All right.
Well done.
Thank you, guys. Let me just wrap up with some thoughts. And the first thing I want to wrap up on is I want to thank the amazing kind of virtual teams that we've had doing all of this stuff. You've just heard from the folks that you've seen behind the scenes. Also, is Omid here in San Francisco, who has figured out how we can do all of this remote switching and has put together a lot of both the graphics and the technology here. Drew Youngs in Marin has been put together. He's our musical director. You haven't met him yet, but he'll be joining us, and you'll hear some of his creations when we go out in a moment. We had this interesting conversation about are we dealing with what's now or what's next? And I think the conceit when we started this show is that this crisis is probably leading to one of the fastest moments of cultural and economic and media environment changes in our history. All at once, we're isolated and we're learning how to use social media to connect anew. And we see cultural organizations and museums and conferences and performers who've long dabbled in the virtual are now finding this is an existential moment really to adapt and thrive or even become irrelevant. So the impact on the economy that we're seeing is profound and devastating. And to many of the points brought up today, it's probably going to force a deeper and more urgent, action-oriented conversation about flourishing local economies than we've had and how to get beyond extractive culture. And this is all happening in real time as so many of these networks of people that are out there, the World Economic Forum, Techonomy, TED, MIT Media Lab, are all adapting and trying to come together. And I think what a number of us working on this project believe is that, that this crisis is going to pass, but we're going to be left with new forms of culture and interaction and community and shopping and media patterns. And it's as if we've been suddenly transported into some virtual future where our minds flourish, but we are kind of physically disconnected. And we have almost a moment to understand that and to form a future, to put the values together to form a future. And it's the purpose of this little project of Quarantime to connect and depict, to tell the stories about and provide a forum for this evolution. So more than a podcast, what we aspire to be really is a cast of pods, connecting a community that's reporting on and discussing the future, and with intention to create a value spaces for the world. And we took as our own inspiration the fact that when you watch TV on MSNBC or CNN, it's the breathless feed of White House statements or statistics or what the Federal Reserve did today. We wanted to focus on the artists, the creative community, social entrepreneurs, experimenters, the deep science world that's bringing about change. So as we go on, this show will be some entertainment, curious and connecting. We're really trying to build this for a moment when social and emotional and media needs are different perhaps than they were yesterday. So our aspiration is to build a foundation and connections for a more resilient tomorrow, which is why we'll be back here tomorrow or the next day doing more of this. Thank you so much for joining us today for Quarantine.
You can share from a distance or in time. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk. Ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba.